So my mum's told me, Gayatri, when you were a baby, every time I'd take you on a train and a stranger came into the compartment, you'd start crying your head off. So I was always a little bit of a wimp as a kid. Growing up, I didn't take too many risks. I'd go to school and come straight back home. And I remember one time I didn't do that. I stayed out in the library studying until 9 p.m. or something. And as I was walking back home, I saw my dad emerging from the darkness of the street, a flashlight in his hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked him. And he said, "Well, you didn't come home like you usually do," so I got a bit worried. In my 20s, I did get tired of living inside this box. And one fine day, I told my parents, "Look, Mum and Dad, I know you guys really want me to be a doctor, but I think I'm going to become a journalist instead." And they weren't too happy. But I did go to journalism school. And these foreign correspondents would come and visit, and I greatly admired them. They were telling stories from the fringes of society about things I admired. And there was also something else. They had an aura of coolness about them in their beige multi-pocket Voyagers vests, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be fearless. And a few years later, I happened to be in Ethiopia for work, and that's when I heard of this story. The Ethiopian government was taking land away from indigenous camel and cattle herders and giving it to rich business interests for farming. This was a story that needed to be told. The problem was I didn't really feel very safe in Ethiopia. Maybe it's because I'm a small Indian woman in a strange country all alone, but it was also more than that. There seemed to be a culture of fear all around me. For example, whenever I called up people to talk on some story or the other, my contacts would get worried that the government might be listening in, that their phones were tapped. And the government also had a bad reputation for jailing journalists. Just a few months before I got there, they had arrested 2 Swedish journalists on charges of terrorism. These journalists had essentially been doing journalism in an area without a permit, and I think ultimately they were in jail for about 400 days. So I decided to do the right thing, and I went to the media minder, who's the government guy who oversees all foreign journalists. And I told him, I was savvy, I didn't tell him what I actually wanted to do. I said I wanted to do a story on agriculture. And he said no. And I walked out of there, and I felt torn. I was scared, but then I told myself, this is your chance, Gayatri, you have to do this. You have to be fearless. So I went out there and I hired a SUV and a driver, and I got this fixer who's this thin, spunky girl with a cigarette hanging from her lips all the time. And we headed out to this region. It was called Afar. And just to place Afar in some context, if you know of Lucy, which is the oldest human ancestor ever found, I think she lived 3.2 million years ago. Her skeletons were found in this region. So as you might imagine, it's very dry and arid, except for a stretch along a river called the Awash River, which is extremely fertile, which is why the government was taking it away from indigenous folks and giving it to rich business interests. So we went out and we got all these great interviews. The Faris were willing to talk to me because I look Ethiopian. I don't actually stand out. And the Faris are very fierce people, very heavily armed with Kalashnikov assault rifles and machetes, ready to protect their own. And they told us a little bit about their challenges. And we had all this great material, and one afternoon, we found ourselves giving a lift to 3 of them in the backseat of the SUV, driving down a dusty desert road, approaching a military checkpoint. I quickly put my camera and audio recordings in my backpack and hid that under my seat, and I hoped that the officers would not ask me any questions, because when I opened my mouth, they'd know I'm a foreigner and I'm not supposed to be there. And I was literally sitting on top of the evidence of my crime, my camera. So the SUV pulled up, and I wasn't sure whether to make eye contact or is that just going to make them ask me questions. So I looked straight ahead, and the officers just glanced over the SUV and waved us on. Later that week, we had all these great audio recordings that needed to get translated, and my fixer couldn't do it because she didn't know the local Afari language. So she said to me, "Let's go to the marketplace, and I'll get these translated." I was pretty paranoid by that point. Being around a lot of guys with guns tends to do that to you. But I didn't have much of a choice. There are very few people in this world who speak the Afari language, and most of them were in that town. So we headed out to the market. It was this short stretch of stores in a dusty square lit with incandescent bulbs. And my fixer was not the brightest person, so she started going out to random people and asking them for help getting these recordings translated. And that's when this man approached us, and he asked her, "What are you guys doing here?" And she said, we just have these recordings, we need to get translated. And he said, well, you're not supposed to be here. And she said, well, I'm an Ethiopian citizen. I can be wherever I want to be. And I was watching her, and I saw this glow of indignant rage come over her face. And I couldn't understand what was going on because I didn't know the language. My fixer told me all this later. But I could tell something terrible was happening. Pretty soon, the two were yelling at each other, and a crowd had gathered around us. And I was in a place where I was not supposed to be, in a country that has a reputation for jailing journalists. This could go bad really quickly. So that's when I decided to step in, and I commanded my fixer, let's go right now. It was not fear I felt, it was a survival instinct telling me to get out of there. That's when the man turned to me and he said in English, I know you guys are journalists, you're not supposed to be here. I'm with the government, and I'm going to call the police right now. And he took out his phone. It was a black flip phone. And he punched in the numbers, and he put it to his ear. And I waited. And then he folded it back and put it in his pocket. I grabbed my fixer's hand, and I pulled her through the crowd, and the man shouted after us that he'd come after us the next day. Apparently what had happened was the government had jammed all cell phone networks that evening for some reason, and no one in town could make any phone calls. I wanted to get out of there immediately, but we couldn't reach her driver because the cell phone networks were jammed. And there was only one hotel in town, so the guy could easily find us, so we spent half the night trying to find a different place to sleep, and the other half just waiting for a knock on the door and someone to come arrest us. The next morning, the driver showed up at the appointed time around 6 a.m., and we got out of there. And about 30 minutes out of town, the cell phone started working again, and it was a beautiful sunrise. Before this experience, I'd always assumed that I'd wanted to be fearless, but this made me grow up overnight. After this, I knew what real fear was, and since then I've taken much more calculated risks. Thank you.